Hey everyone, I hope you're doing well. If you're experiencing pops and clicks and distorted audio, well, today's video is for you. In this situation, I'm using the AudioBox 96 from Presonus. This is a 2-channel USB audio interface. It's extremely affordable, and a lot of times these affordable audio interfaces, people run into trouble, and I don't think it's primarily due to the audio interface. It might have to do with your settings that you're using in your software and also the computer that you have. So let's explore all those different possibilities and capabilities in today's video so that you have the cleanest audio possible. The best way you can support the channel is hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Now let's jump into Presonus Studio One and I'll show you how to clean up your audio. So the first thing I want to show you is just playing music back. So without even recording anything, if you've got a session pulled up in Presonus Studio One and you have several plugins loaded, at the bottom of the screen, you're going to see a performance meter. So the performance meter is going to generally give you an idea of how much weight your computer is having to handle by processing all the different plugins and all of the different software things that are happening behind the scenes. So right now my CPU is working at 46%. This is really, really high. I don't normally see these kinds of numbers, especially with a small session as I have. So if you're interested in your performance meter, just go to the bottom of Studio One with a session open and click where it says performance. It'll kind of give you a readout. I'll try to keep this open as often as possible so that you're aware of what kind of audio we're dealing with. So here I have a session pulled up, and the first thing I want to do is just see how the audio sounds. I'm just going to play a little bit of a chorus. Let's take a listen.
When I look up, He will provide and fill my cup.
All right, that sounds good to me. And as you can see, we're hovering right around 47% when the audio is playing. So this is a good setting, but let's see where we're at. If you go to Studio One at the top, then go to where it says options. Here's where we normally select our audio interface of choice. Make sure you have your audio interface selected. If you're using something like Windows audio or system audio on a Mac, that's usually no good. You're gonna get a lot of pops and cracks, so you definitely need to at least look into something like the AudioBox from Presonus or the Focusrite Scarlett. Some sort of affordable audio interface will get you leaps and bounds beyond system audio. Now we have this thing called device block size, and this is really what's going to make or break it when it comes to distorted pops and clicks in your audio. At the moment, I have it set to 512 samples, and I'm recording at 48 kilohertz. 9 out of 10 scenarios out there, 90% chance that if you set your audio interface to 512 samples with 48 kilohertz, your system should be able to handle it. It's the year 2024. This wouldn't be true even back in 2008, 2009. This was a lot of weight being put on our CPUs, but for all intents and purposes, 512 samples is usually middle of the road. Now, it shows you in Presonus Studio One how much latency you're dealing with. Latency refers to the delay, how long it's going to take for us to hear the audio that we are recording. And we'll get to that in just a minute. But right now you're seeing my input latency is 12 milliseconds. My output latency is 14.4 milliseconds. That's pretty good. If you're familiar with like guitar pedals and delay, 10 milliseconds is definitely audible, something that you can hear, but anything around 7 milliseconds or so or less, it becomes inaudible. It almost just sounds like not even a chorus effect, but you shouldn't be noticing it too much. Now, why would you want to change this number, 512? The reason you'd want to change it is how much weight you're putting on your computer to process. If I raise this to 2048 samples, this is the highest number I can set with this AudioBox 96, look what happens to my latency. Now my latency numbers jumped up to 44 milliseconds. 44 milliseconds is definitely going to be audible when you're doing playback and you're recording, okay? So my input latency went to 44 milliseconds, my output latency went to 50 milliseconds. Not only that, if we go back to our session and we hit play,
When I look up, when I look up, He will provide and fill my cup.
our audio sounds nice and clean, and look at our CPU usage. So our CPU went from using 47% down to 41%. That's because when you raise this number to something like 2048, the higher this number or the higher your buffer settings, the more power you're giving to your computer to run plugins and software. Okay. So if your computer is struggling and it's just maxing out at 100%, you need to go in here and try to raise that buffer size or raise your block size to something like 2048 or 1024. The negative of this, and the reason that you don't want to keep that setting in place, is because now we have a ton of latency. So just to give you an idea of what it looks like, I'm going to hold this SM57 next to this SM7B. The SM7B is going straight into my camera. So this is my control. There shouldn't be any latency between my voice and what you're seeing on the camera. If I put the SM57 right next to the microphone, what you're going to be able to hear as soon as I turn it on, you're going to start hearing that 50 millisecond delay in action. So as soon as I hit monitoring right here on a new track, test 1, 2, testing, test, latency, delay, delay. Okay, in that example, when I'm recording using that much latency, it's going to be almost impossible for me to sing. It's going to be impossible for me to play guitar. This will be a horrendous setting. So hopefully, if you've got a good computer, your CPU is something like an i7 or something newer. If you're running a MacBook, maybe an M1 or something more modern, you shouldn't have to raise your block size this high. You probably can get away with 512. So if I go back to 512, let me give you an example of 12 millisecond delay. Test, delay, 1. That's much more manageable. So again, anything around 10 milliseconds or less, it's going to be negligible that you're hearing any sort of delay. Let's push this thing to the limit because there's a lot more that you can do in Presonus Studio One. Let's say we just wanted no latency whatsoever. If I set this block size to 32 samples, I'm now looking at a 2 millisecond delay. I'm not seeing hardly any latency at all. But as you can see, if I click the performance meter, my CPU is pegged out. It's absolutely terrible. So you will have limitations with your audio interface at what your block size can be. Let's try something like 128 samples. That's a 4 millisecond delay. Our CPU is right around 61, 62%. Test 1, 2. Test 1, 2. Test. Delay 1. All right, that sounds good to me. So definitely per session, you're going to want to know how to change these settings. And I'll just say this as well. If you're somebody who does a lot of virtual instruments, synthesizers, electronic drum kits, loop-based recording, if you've got a lot of plugins loaded, this will change depending on your session. I'm somebody that, like, if I have 24 tracks in a session, probably 3 or 4 of those might be MIDI instruments. I can get away with a smaller block size because I don't need to put that much weight on my CPU. Your computer is not going to have to work as hard if you're not using a lot of plugins and if you're recording a lot of acoustic type material. If you're doing MIDI instruments, anything that's more demanding on your computer, you could easily have a session with just 3 tracks, but those 3 tracks have tons of demanding plugins on them and processing. It's going to be different in your scenario, but here's what makes Studio One really stand out from the rest. All right, so I've got my block size set to 1024, and I should be experiencing a 22 millisecond delay on my latency. If you go to the processing tab, this is really what sets Studio One apart. We have something called dropout protection, which yours may be set to off, low, medium, or high. I want you to set it to maximum, and this is going to definitely depend on what kind of CPU or processor you're using. I have a Windows machine that I built way back in the day, and it has an Intel i7, 32 gigabytes of RAM. It's got SSDs and a graphics card. So I try to max out my computer so that it can definitely handle the little bit of audio sessions I'm doing. But with it set to maximum, I'm going to check off this thing for enable plugin NAP and then enable low latency monitoring for instruments. If I hit OK, I want you to notice on your mix window, if you open up the mix tab and go to where it has the main fader, you're going to see this little Z. Now, if you're in dark mode, this may be a different color of a gray or a white for you, but I want you to notice something that happens. If I click input monitoring, test 1, 2, you should be hearing a delay. As soon as I click the Z, which is enable low latency monitoring. Test 1, 2. All of a sudden, my latency is dramatically shifted. Okay, this is something that I can clearly speak on top of. Earlier, when I'm talking about how to click this button, it's hard to get words out because it sounds like there's two people inside of your head talking at the same time. It is putting more weight on your CPU. So right now we're at about 55, 56%. But with my CPU, as long as I'm not hitting 80, 90%, I'm going to be okay with that because in my sessions, I'm not doing that much heavy lifting at all. But I hope you've been able to see the wide gamut of what's possible using even the AudioBox 96. So just to recap, you definitely want to be aware of how much latency you're dealing with your audio interface, whether that's the AudioBox or the Focusrite Scarlett. Make sure you open up the Settings tab in Presonus Studio One, go to Audio Setup, make sure your audio interface is selected. I'd highly recommend you sitting at 512 samples or higher if your CPU can handle it. And then go over to the processing tab, make sure you have dropout protection on maximum. When you go to record and somebody wants to hear themselves, make sure you hit this Z button just underneath the main fader so that you're hearing the least amount of latency possible. And if you start having problems with your CPU, you've already recorded your session, just simply turn it off and your CPU should have some more headroom to work on plugins and things. I really hope that's been beneficial to you. For more videos, tips, and tutorials of Presonus Studio One, make sure you hit the subscribe button. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.